The power of value is incredible. And here's an illustration to show you what I mean. About once a year, I hold one of these in front of my students and I ask, "What is this?" And of course, they look at me stupid because, well, it's obvious. It's a $1 bill, so it's worth $1. I say, "Okay, it's worth $1, but hmm, what if I throw it in the trash? How much is it worth then?" And they say, "Well, it's still worth $1. What if I give it away or if I spend it? How much is it worth? It's still $1, even if it's not yours." What if I flush it down the toilet? Or I bury it in the ground and it gets dirty or wet? How much is it worth? And of course, the reply is, well, it's still worth $1. Okay, then. What if I tear it into pieces or rip a hole through it? How much is it worth then? And some of them gasp sometimes, but most of the time they say, well, it's still worth $1. And they would be right. It's still worth $1. Now, some people look at that and say, I know what you did. You didn't actually poke a hole through it at all. And then I do it again without the paper because, well, hey, you missed the point. No matter what you do to this dollar bill, how much is it worth? It's still worth $1. Even with that hole in the center of it, it is still worth $1. In fact, they say that as long as you have over 50%, they will still accept it as $1. Let me say it again. No matter what you do to that dollar bill, as long as it still exists, it's still worth $1. And that's just one example of the power of value. And your value is similar. It doesn't matter what someone says, does, or thinks of you. It doesn't matter what you say, do, or think of yourself. It doesn't even matter what happens to you. Your value never changes, and it's priceless. The value you hold is of an untold potential. Ever heard of the butterfly effect? They say a single flap of a butterfly wing can lead to a tornado on the other side of the world. While that arguably may be an exaggeration, it's easily proven that one individual's choices affects many others in a cascading domino effect of influence, so that a single action, such as a flap of a butterfly wing, can lead to disaster somewhere else. And that concept isn't quite that far fetched. A single one of your actions affects countless others. What does a lifetime of choices mean when regarding to your value? Your life could affect, save, encourage, spur on, create, invest, and altogether impact hundreds of people. The people you interact with on a daily basis. Those people, in turn, affect hundreds more, and so on the effect goes. It shouldn't be much of a stretch to say you can indirectly influence the world just from the daily choices you make. Your life is of utmost importance, and no one can take your value away from you. Such is the great value of life. If you don't believe me, let me prove it to you. For truth exists, but it's up to us to find it and put our trust in it. In fact, this YouTube channel was created to answer the difficult questions of life. Metaphysical questions such as, who is God? Is there a God? Or many gods? Why is there such suffering in the world? Or is there any meaning to life at all? What is right and wrong? What is man's problem or woman's problem? Does humanity have a problem? And is there a solution? What is the solution, if there is one? And what is our purpose? But wait, before we can answer any of those questions, we must first answer the question, why should I care? Any educator will tell you apathy is the absolute worst enemy of learning. And the majority of time, apathy stems from self loathing. I'm not good at this, so I'm just not going to care about it. I don't understand this, so I'm just going to tune it out. I'm not going to use this in the future anyway, so why bother? It's too hard. I'm never going to get this. I'm not smart enough. I don't deserve better anyway. Sometimes these thoughts are subconscious and we are unaware that we are actually putting ourselves down in the process. I can't tell you how many times in my career as an educator that I've had students come up to me and say, "My teacher told me I was stupid. They said I was bad at this subject or that subject. They said I'd never amount to anything." I've never had a stronger urge to slap another human being in my life than at those moments. Like, who are you to say something so demented, so demeaning, so antagonistic, and so blatantly false to a little kid? It makes me want to read James 3:1 to them, just stop mid verse. Not many of you should presume to be teachers. There are so many different talents and strengths and weaknesses each of us have. Being weak in one or two or even five subjects in school does not make someone stupid. I had a friend who considered herself stupid because she struggled with math, but she was an absolute genius when it came to arts and drawing. Someone's value as a human being does not rely upon such simple confounds. Albert Einstein once said, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll live its entire life believing it's stupid. I'm going to say it again. Everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. You cannot judge a person by someone else's strength. It just doesn't work that way. You're not even comparing apples to oranges here. So the real question is, what really is the true value of a human life? And who really cares about any of this anyway? My first year teaching, I lost two of my students. One to a tragic car crash, and another committed suicide. The tragedy of the young youth's suicide was made worse in that the very next day his classmates came into the classroom and was talking about him, and was asking who he was, not realizing he had sat right next to him the very day before. Who cares? Someone commits suicide every 40 seconds. A child is left orphaned every 15 seconds. 3 abortions occur every 2 seconds. And someone is raped at least once every minute. Oh, but that last one was just a statistic for the United States. The rest of those are global statistics. So, who cares about the value of human life? Human potential is nearly limitless, and yet suicide ends that potential. Who cares about human value? Those left behind. Every year since I lost one of my precious students to suicide, I've told my students the same exact thing. It's my number one unspoken rule. You are not allowed to die before me. After the initial shock that I would say something so irrational, they would never respond, but what if I get hit by a car? What if I get shot? What if I die of cancer? What if I get run over by a semi? My answer is always the same, no matter how unrealistic it may be. No, you are not allowed to die before me. That's how highly I value human life, to the point of insanity. But not everyone agrees with me. Flossinosinahilipilification is an actual English word, and it means the act or habit of determining the value of something as worthless. However, there is nothing that has a flat value of complete worthlessness. So let us look into the surprisingly complex concept of value. There's a specific infrastructure as to what and how we determine the value of something. Although this infrastructure is intricate, multifarious, and interdependent, I will attempt to illustrate this infrastructure for better understanding in the hopes that we may be able to see exactly how valuable human life really is. First, there are two distinctives. There's component value and comprehensive value. Component value is the value of a particular part of a whole unit. For instance, the heart pumps blood through the body, and for that reason has a specific and special value in comparison to the whole body. The value of an eye or an ear may be slightly different from the value of a finger or a hair follicle. Even so, they are all, however, part of the whole body, and that is what a comprehensive value is, the value of the object as a whole. So let me give an example of the interrelated interactions and differences between component and comprehensive value. This is a mousetrap. You probably already knew that. The mousetrap is fundamentally simple yet irreducibly complex. What I mean by irreducibly complex is that it cannot be reduced down any further than it is in this picture without it losing functionality. 5 components are included here. There's the platform upon which everything rests and is built upon, the spring that builds up pressure, the hold down bar that keeps the pressure from releasing prematurely, the catch that releases the hold bar down when it's pressed upon, and the hammer that comes down upon the unsuspecting mouse when the catch is released. All of what I just described was each piece's component value, none of which alone illustrated the comprehensive value of the mousetrap, which is to catch unwanted small creatures like mice. And thus the component value, although an integral part of the comprehensive value, is not the same as the comprehensive value itself. That's why it's common to hear the phrase, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. Now, whether it is comprehensive or component, there are 4 different aspects or characteristics of value that must be considered. And I call these the 4 cardinal aspects of value. These 4 cardinal aspects are internal, external, stable, and flux. Internal value simply means that the value stems from within the object itself. An oven is valuable because it is able to heat up our food, and that value stems from the oven's ability itself. This is in contrast to external value, which comes from the outside of the object. Okay, so brand names is a perfect example of this. A brand name may have a greater value than a generic brand, not because of the item itself, but because of the fame and popularity of the brand. Stable means the value remains relatively unchanged regardless of changing external circumstances, while flux is the term for a value that is directly affected by those external circumstances. Now, this could confuse some people, so listen closely to what I am saying. I am not saying a stable value never changes. What I am saying is that external circumstances have little to no direct influence on a stable value. For example, the value of a childhood memory is not going to be directly influenced by external circumstances. It's true, a childhood memory will fade over time, and new information might change how a person values the memory. However, the external circumstances will never directly influence the stable value of that childhood memory. Indirectly, perhaps, but the person holding the memory will always hold the determining factor in how they value that memory, not some external factor. A perfect example of a value in flux would be gas prices, economies, supply and demand, the stock market, Middle East politics, natural disasters, weathers, summers and holidays, weekends, and even speculation from the press. They can all have a direct effect on the price of gasoline on any given day. Hopefully, these examples have illustrated that we see and rate value in many different ways. And if you take our 4 cardinal aspects and align them to the arrows of a compass, then that makes 4 quadrants. And I have found 4 definitions of value that correlate with each of these 4 quadrants. Existential value is determined from existence. Simply by existing, it proffers a certain amount of value. Our founding fathers knew this principle all too well. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This staunch statement that begins the historical document that arguably marks the beginning of this great nation, the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers measured humanity's value or inalienable right to include life. Why? Because it was endowed to us by our Creator. It was granted us at the instant of our existence. Because we exist, we hold value and have a right to life. Another way to express existential value is to consider that even for us to observe something, we must hold a measure of value to it to even register that it exists. If you're considering the color scheme on the screen, then you first had to place value on it to such an extent that you deemed it profitable to consider it for as long as you have. Let me put a caveat here, because some philosophers take this too far. This is not to say that our perception is what gives it value, or its existence, or any whatnot shenanigans. It has innate value not because we perceive it, but we perceive it because of its innate value and existence. If you want proof of this, all you have to do is look at it from a slightly different perspective. Even if we do not perceive it, that does not mean it does not exist or have innate value. I have never seen the Gobi Desert. That does not mean it does not exist. I have never seen an electron of an atom. That does not mean it does not have value. We can perceive things because those things have value. Our perception does not create the value of those things we observe. Further evidence that objects have existential value is object permanence, something we learn at a very young age. In line with what we discussed, all humans learn very quickly as young infants that just because mommy left the room, that does not mean mommy ceased to exist. The object of value, in this case, mommy, is independent of the observer, the baby, which gives rise to the fact that the object exists independent and thus has a value external to the observer. Existential value is both internal and stable. No external circumstances change the value of an object's existence, and that value is derived from the object's existing in the first place. Thus, this definition belongs in the northwest quadrant of our compass. Utilitarian comes from the word utility, which is another way of saying function or purpose. Utilitarian value comes directly from the use or benefit the item has in fulfilling a certain purpose or function. A car's utility is to transport an object from one point to another. A toaster's utility is to toast bread. This value is internal, for the skill, talent, or function of the item stems from its very own ability. It is in flux, however, because its usefulness all depends upon the circumstance in which it is found. For instance, the internal value of a crowbar makes it very valuable when attempting to pull up floorboards. However, if I am attempting to change the batteries inside my stereo, the value of the crowbar goes down drastically. In fact, it may go into the negatives if I use my crowbar on my stereo. Chances are I will not be able to fix the damages. The screwdriver would have a high utilitarian value in that circumstance, while it would likewise have a very low utilitarian value in pulling up floorboards. Thus, although utilitarian value is internal, it remains in flux, depending upon the external circumstances. Thus, this definition belongs in the northeast quadrant of our compass. These definitions are not completely independent of each other. There's always a lot of interconnectedness between the four different definitions, two of which we've discussed so far. A good example of the interrelatedness between existential and utilitarian definitions is what I call potential value. Potential value is the utilitarian value that an object potentially has for future issues. The existence of the utility provides value, even if the item is not immediately in use. A great example would be items such as flashlights or umbrellas. Two items that are only used in very special and specific situations, and yet can be found in nearly every household. Even if it is not in use at the moment, it has great value, potential value, should a situation arise in which it is needed. Sentimental value is the third definition, and is perhaps the most contradictory of the value systems. Sentimental value is purely subjective based upon the emotional value placed upon it by the individual. As such, one object may and typically holds great value to one person and little to no value to most other people. A childhood toy, a teddy bear, a blankie, or a precious memento. Sentimental value can be placed on the most common to the most rare of items. It matters not what it is, but nearly every human on the planet attaches sentimental value to certain things. Sentimental value is the most subjective of the values, and perhaps the most fickle. Despite it being fickle and subjective, drastically changing from person to person, the contradictory nature of sentimental value is that it is actually considered stable. As mentioned earlier in this video, stable value does not mean that it does not change, but it is not directly affected by external circumstances. So although the value is determined externally from the individual who has a sentimental attachment to it, that sentimental value does not change from altering circumstances. Only the source of that attachment, the individual whom holds it, can in any way alter the value of that sentiment. Thus, although it sounds contradictory, sentimental value is very stable, unchanging unless the individual who holds it, from which the value derives itself from, decides to change it. But never can it be changed by any external circumstances outside that individual. Sentimental value, thus, would fit within the southwestern quadrant of our compass. Perhaps the easiest definition to determine and to understand is the economic value. It is also likely the most arbitrary value there is as well. Economic value includes the financial price of items, added fees, insurances, interest percentages, and even such things as manual fees, mechanical and technical costs, among other such considerations. Financial systems are, by their nature, arbitrary. They're based around mutually agreed social values that is equivalent to a certain external value. Supply and demand, the stock market, inflation, taxes, and many other external circumstances can all have an effect on the economic value of an object. Even time can have an effect. Consider the value of this car. Any car devalues by 20% after the first year of ownership, and 15% for every year after that. The interesting thing about economic value is that external value tends to be based upon internal value. In the system of supply and demand, demand stems from a need which the item fulfills, which provides a utilitarian value, which is internal in nature, and thus we see yet again the interconnectedness of the values. Economic value finds itself through arbitrary monetary concepts, and thus it's not only just an external value, but one that is in constant flux depending upon external circumstances. It thus belongs in the southeast quadrant of our compass, and here we have all four definitions in their corresponding locations. Existential value, which is both stable and internal. Sentimental value, which is external and stable. Utilitarian value, that's internal and flux. And then economic, which is both external and flux. So what does any of this have to do with human value? Well, consider how you define your own value. Is it by your work, utilitarian value? That can be dangerous since it's in constant flux. What if you lose your work, or if your work loses its own significance? Is it by how much you own, economic value? That's quite arbitrary, and you can't take it with you. Sentimental value, perhaps. Do you define your value by those closest to you? But then your life only matters to those few people, right? Is that right? What is your true value as a human being? Is it your value merely located in your desire to live? Existential value. Is your purpose in life just to survive? However, survival does not necessitate any measure of the quality of life and is an instinct more than a purpose, is it not? So where does our value truly stem, and where should we derive it from? The practice of delving into these philosophical definitions, existential, utilitarian, sentimental, economic, it is well worth the time to take in. And let me provide some further illustrations of the importance of these four definitions and the relationships between them. Now, as we look at those four quadrants, there are three patterns worth looking into. The first one is between sentimental and economic values. They both tend to be extremely relative due to their external nature. Sentimental value, by definition, is personal and thus not universal. It changes from person to person. Economic value is socially bound and based upon arbitrary financial systems. Due to their relative nature, sentimental and economic values are useful for social matters and are typically easily recognized. These values allow us to operate in a more efficient and smooth manner than otherwise would be possible. Sentimental value provides emotional stability, and economic value provides the foundation for trade and support. Interestingly enough, in delving into sentimental and economic value, we find that they themselves are actually quite utilitarian in their application. The second pattern we see is that utilitarian and existential values are closely related with purpose due to their internal nature. Utilitarian value tends to be defined by its utility, function, ability, and usefulness. It tends to answer the question, what does it do? When asked what is the purpose of something, the most common answer is what it does. For instance, what's the purpose of a heart? The value of the heart is its ability to pump blood to the rest of the body. That's its purpose. It's what it does. Existential value, the value within existence, comes from the distinct reason for why it was created. This answers the question, why? Consider someone coming up to you and saying, look, look what I invented. Well, the first question is probably going to be, what's it do? What's its function, as in the utilitarian value? The next question will probably be, why? And in this, we can see the utilitarian and existential values are very closely related to one another in their pursuit of purpose. Although they're very similar, one thing that's interesting is utilitarian tends to answer component value questions of what it does. Existential is typically comprehensive value. But here's a very important caveat. Science can never answer the question why, for it's outside of science jurisdiction. Science can only answer what or how something works, not why. A very important distinction. The scientific method entails that which is observable, repeatable, and testable. Philosophical questions such as why cannot be included within its vernacular. And now, in the English language, many people ask the question, why does this work? That is actually a how question, not a why question. Why does this work? Well, this does this and that does that, which in turn makes this do that, and it produces X. Oh, that's how it works. To stem human curiosity, many times answering how it works is enough. But that still does not answer the question why. Here's a concrete example. Why are the primary colors of light different than the primary colors when mixing paint? Okay, for example, in light, the absence of color is black, and the inclusion of all color is white. But when mixing paint, the inclusion of all color is black, while the absence is white. But it's not so simple as being opposite of each other. The primary colors of paint, as we learn in primary school, is red, yellow, and blue. But the primary colors of light are red, yellow, and green. Why? I could explain to you how light hits an object and the colors within the light get either absorbed or reflected, and the color reflected is what hits the cornea of your eye and makes you see color. But that's how we see color. I could tell you how different animals have different eye systems with different rods and cones, and some animals actually are able to see many colors that we can't. For example, the manuscript has 16 different color receptors in their eye, compared to us who only have 3. But that doesn't answer my original question either. Even if the question is answered how they are different, still does not answer the question why they are different. Gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared here on Earth, and gravity is determined by the mass of the object, which is in this case the Earth. However, this equation that deals with the mass of the Earth explains how gravity works, and thus quote unquote, why gravity works and why gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared. But it does not explain why gravity works the way it does or why that ratio is the specific ratio it is. And that's actually very important. I'm not just cutting hairs here. Scientists have found that if universal gravity was just a bit weaker, no heavier elements would form, and therefore there would be no planets like ours, and thus no life in the universe. However, if universal gravity was just a bit heavier, the lighter elements like oxygen would never form. And thus, not only would there be no atmosphere for life to exist in, but there would be no stars. Gravity is just perfectly tuned for life to exist. How will never answer the question why gravity is so perfectly tuned the way it is. From the patterns so far, we have seen that sentimental and economic values are relative in nature and can be seen as extensions of utilitarian value. We've seen existential and utilitarian values revolve around purpose, and while utilitarian values tend to answer the question what or how, existential value tends to answer the question why. In our third pattern, due to their stable characteristics, sentimental and existential values are things that cannot be forcibly taken from you. If someone takes over your job and does a better job than you, your utilitarian value at work may disappear. And if a company's stock market tanks, their economic value might depreciate or even disappear. However, sentimental value and existential value are stable. They will not change due to external force. Now, sentimental value can change, but only if you let it. Existential value will never change. As long as you exist, that value will remain constant, just as the illustration with the dollar bill demonstrated earlier. One thing that comes from this discussion of patterns, as I hope you noticed, utilitarian and existential values are more predominant and held in higher importance than those of sentimental and economic values, due to their external value characteristics. While among the internal values, existential is more difficult to define and yet more important of the two values since it is stable and answers the all important question of why, the question we're all asking. One other thing worth mentioning when speaking about the four definitions of value is that they are not only interrelated, as illustrated earlier, but they're also interdependent. What I mean by that is that they affect one another in a bidirectional manner. Well, all except existential value. Let me show you what I mean. Economic value influences both utilitarian and sentimental value. For instance, the phrase not worth the price is an indication that the economic value is interfering with the utility of the object in question. It assumes the statement that it would be worth the price if it was not so highly priced. And that worth or desire to purchase the item is typically derived from the object's utility. And in that way, economic value directly influences the utility. For economic value's influence on sentimental value, ever heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses? Or have you ever noticed certain people or press being obsessed with anything new with the Kardashians? Economic prestige increases sentimental value. But these are merely passing examples of how economic value could potentially influence other types. Many other examples exist, and just because economic value can influence utilitarian or sentimental value doesn't mean it will in any given case. In the same fashion, however, utilitarian and sentimental value can influence economic value. Hence the bidirectional, interdependent relationship between the value systems. Utilitarian value easily influences economic value, in that economic value increases with the usefulness of the item. An item with no utility will typically have no economic value. On the other hand, name brands have higher economic value simply because of its sentimental value, hence illustrating sentimental value's potential influence upon economic value. Even further, there's a bidirectional relationship between utility and sentiment. The more useful something is, the more likely it's to be used. The more something is used, the more likely memories will form around the item and sentimental value will be placed upon it. On the other hand, regardless of which item is best, An item that has sentimental value will tend to be chosen over better options simply because of its sentimental value, thus elevating its actual utility even if a different object has higher potential utility than the sentimental object. However, this bidirectional influence is not applicable to the existential value. Existential value influences the other three value systems. However, existential value and existential value alone is undisturbed by the influence of the other three systems. Let me give you some concrete examples. If an item is created for a specific purpose or to fill a need, it increases the utilitarian value of the item. If an item is created with tenderness and care, especially if it's for a specific person, the sentimental value of the item increases. If an item is created to fill a demand or need, it increases the economic value of this item. In fact, that's the very basis of supply and demand. Find a demand, provide the supply. However, an item's utility does not affect existential value. Even if you use an item for something other than what it was created for, that doesn't change the existential value of that item. Whether you hold an item with high sentimentality or not doesn't affect its existence, nor does the price tag arbitrarily placed upon it by society. Now, here's where the rubber meets the road, and subsequently where the controversy comes in. There are those who argue that there is no such thing as existential value. No value comes from merely existing, or so they would say. They believe value has to come from one of the other three systems. So, how does one go about determining or defining existential value then? In other words, if we do in fact have existential value, just how much is that value and how can you determine it? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you create something or invent something, it could be easily argued that you, therefore, instigated the existence of that item you created or invented. So, where would the existential value come from? As was mentioned before, existential value is tied closely together with purpose, in particular with the question why. Thus, we conclude by extension, the existential value stems from the intent of the one who created it. And here's where things get dicey. About 10% of the population of the world flat out reject the idea that the universe was created. A loud minority to be sure, but if you include those who are not sure, that number grows drastically. Even though atheism might be a minority, a much larger percentage of the populace agrees with or at least gives lip service to the evolutionary theory of origin, aka man evolved from ape. And there are only really two viable options for the origin of humanity. We were either created or we evolved by chance. If we evolved by chance, our existential value is similarly vague. By chance. By chance, you exist as a human at all and not a clump of mud or an amoeba or a strand of grass or a tick on a donkey's ass. By chance, you exist at all. Thus, your existential value is, well, ambiguous. There's no purpose behind your existence, so there's no purpose within your existential value. And this can be confirmed by atheists throughout the ages. Here's some of their own words. Jean-Paul Sartre. Life has no meaning the moment you lose the illusion of being eternal. Maugham. Now the answer is plain, but it's so unpalpable that most men will not face it. There's no reason for life, and life has no meaning. Curon. The fact that life has no meaning is a reason to live, moreover, the only one. Miller. Life has to be given a meaning because of the fact that it has no meaning. Bohr. The meaning of life consists in the fact that it makes no sense to say that life has no meaning. Greenwood. Life has no meaning but what we give it. I wish a few more of ye would give it a little. Perhaps the last two quotes are the most telling, because if you have to arbitrarily create a purpose, is it truly a purpose? Or simply just a goal, a wish, or a desire? I can use a toaster as a blunt object, a weapon to bash someone's head in, but that's not the purpose it was created for. True, I used it for a specific purpose, to bash someone's head in. Don't worry, no one was injured in the process of making this video. But that was its utilitarian value, its utilitarian purpose, what I did with it. It's not the true existential purpose of why it exists. And let's all be honest here, that's the real question we're all asking. Why we exist. To make up our own purpose is to limit ourselves to utilitarian value. We all innately desire an existential purpose, and that is admitted by atheists the world over at their most honest moments. And that second to last quote is probably a perfect example of that. He said, "We say there is a purpose because it doesn't make sense to say there's no purpose." He's talking about existential purpose here. The problem is, atheism has no way to answer that. However, if humanity was created, then our existential value and purpose stems from the reason we were created. A toaster does not make up its own purpose in and of itself, but the purpose stems from the reason it was created, to toast bread. It can be used for other functions, just like a car can be used as a race car, used for demolition derbies, or used to get you to the supermarket. That doesn't change the existential purpose or value for which it was created, to get you from point A to point B. Thus, if humanity was created, then our purpose stems from the one who created us and the reason why we were created. And that reason, the reason why, a reason no one and nothing can ever take from you, a truly objective and stable value. Far from being worth a single dollar, your worth is defined by the one who created you, and the worth can never be changed. Far from being worthless, you're priceless. Not because I say so, but because you were created for a purpose as a precious child of God. Don't believe me? Then join me next time when I go deeper into a discussion of whether life came from chance or if we were truly created. Let me challenge you on this. If we came from chance, then our value truly is nothing but what left up to chance, void of all reason. However, if we truly are created, your existential value is found only by determining the purpose for which you were created. And that makes all the difference in the world. For the other three value systems are either subjective, arbitrary, or fleeting. Only existential value can answer the burning question of humanity. Why do I exist? And those are really the only two options available to us. Intentionally created or incidental accidents. We should know for certain which one is really real. For truth does exist, but it's up to us to find it and place our trust in it.